Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all here. This is our joint teach-in hosted by the racial and climate justice groups at Kehillah with our wonderful guest speaker, Michael Lomotey, who is one of our own. He's a Kehillah member as well as one of our service leaders, and he's just completed some master's in-depth academic studies on the intersection between climate and racial justice in a specific area, which he'll be sharing with us tonight. And before I hand it over to Tamara, who's going to introduce Michael more formally, I just wanted to say a few words as the rabbi of Kehillah to ground what we're doing tonight in where we are in the Torah. So this week, we just started the book of Leviticus, Vayikra. And famously, it's a harder book to get your hands around narratively than the two books prior, Genesis and Exodus. Genesis is about all the big family dramas, about all the sibling rivalry and sister and brother tension of Abraham and Isaac, Sarah and Rebecca, Leah and Rachel, Cain and Abel, all the big, great human stories that are easy to get invested in. And then the book of Exodus after that is about crossing the Red Sea and leaving Egypt and receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai and thunder. Some of the stories we're going to tell in just a little while at the Passover Seder. And again, easy to bring that to life. It's made into movies for that reason, the Exodus from Egypt. And then we get to this week, to the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, and it's just page after page of ethical codes and mitzvot and what they call the holiness code, the way that we should live our life, and the mind wanders. It's hard to understand where the narrative is. So I wanted to share today one of the most compelling and I think moving ways to think about the book of Leviticus, which is that at the beginning of the whole Torah, we're in the Garden of Eden, we're in utopia. Everything's perfect. We're naked because we don't even need shelter or to be protected because nourishment and compassion are everywhere. They're part of the air that we were breathing in that perfect place. And everything after that expulsion from the garden is struggle. And in fact, the book of Leviticus in that way can be understood as the moment where we try to figure out how do we live ethically in the world as it is, in this wilderness, trying to create the Mishkan, the sanctuary where the divine is going to dwell among us. And how do we really do that in the world that we have created as human beings, which is a broken world that we have in part broken through systemic oppressions that we have been responsible for. So we look around suddenly in this wilderness in Vayikra in Leviticus and we say, how do we live together with all of this brokenness? And that is why there are all these ethical mitzvot, we are told, and all of these plans for how to build the sanctuary that God is going to dwell among us. Or to put it in a more justice framework, how do we live together in an ethical way? And so I think with that grounding, those are the questions that Michael is going to lead us through tonight in that spirit of trying to get back to a new redeemed world that we are redeeming from a place of brokenness back to some notion of redemption that we are all working toward to heal the broken places and to really shine a light on them and to confront them. So in that spirit, I'm going to hand it over to Tamara to introduce Michael.
Yeah, welcome everyone. It's really great to see a lot of people from our racial justice group here and also people who aren't in the group, people from the climate justice group and other corners of Kehillah. I think we wanted to do this event to kind of bring these groups and different parts of our community together to reflect the ways in which climate justice and racial justice are also connected and are both relevant for us as Jews as well. And I'm sure Michael will say more about that. Really looking forward to your talk. So I'm just going to, introduce Michael. We're very lucky to have you in our community, partly because your work really does bridge these two issues. So this was an amazing opportunity for us to be able to hear from someone right within Kehillah about the ways in which racial justice and climate justice are connected and how we can also think about that as Jews. So I'm just going to read a short bio for Michael. So it goes, my work has previously been around the human rights impacts of tourism. I've also worked on sustainable textiles and compliance in charity and fundraising regulations. I'm an RSA fellow and an organizer for climate justice. I gave up work to retrain on climate solutions and have just completed an MSc at the Graduate School for the Environment at the Center for Alternative Technology, researching about this topic for my dissertation. So welcome, Michael, and over to you.
Okay, so you've had that little bit about me. Thanks for introducing me. Thanks everybody for coming along. I'm going to talk to you about my research. It had two stages to it initially, and I looked to understand the perceptions of the Black community on the environment, and I wanted to look at what barriers may exist to taking pro-environmentally responsible behaviours. So what I'll do today, I'll introduce why behaviour change is quite important, and especially in context of my work. I'll talk to you about some of the findings and a little bit about what I believe it means for society, and then there'll be an opportunity for some questions and answers. But first of all, I'm going to take the position that climate change is uncontested in science. It's something that's happening and it's really scary. And heads up, I have a personal frustration that whenever I talk about climate, we often ignore ecology, which is just as worrying and probably even more so. The soil and the ground beneath our feet, the flora and the fauna, they're all under a dangerous and quite a frightening level of risk. So what I tend to do is include both when I say climate. I know it's verbally clunky, but I'm trying to just say climate. And if I do, I mean earth systems, and I mean ecology, and I mean ecosystems. Okay, there we go. So these are the objectives. You've probably heard of the IPCC and the IPBES. They're both really clear that there's great risk and it's coming to every part of society. So all of us need to be ready to meet this challenge. And we can all do things like reducing our emissions or avoiding damaging the ecosystems around us. And we can all do things by making choices which bring environmental benefits. And we call this pro-environmentally responsible behaviour, so PEB. And in the UK, it would mean everyone, including the diversity of ethnic groupings, everybody adapting lifestyles that have responsible behaviours that reduce or lessen impacts. And it's good things like purchasing less, or at least having things that have low embedded emissions, and also taking actions that reduce ecological damage. So things like water conservation or less air pollution, increased active travel. So that's about public transport and cycling or walking, and also sensible food choices, things that don't cause land use change. So PEB, or environmentally responsible behaviours, it's action that's taken consciously to reduce impact. And if you think the impact of a behaviour is what defines that behaviour, it's a good way of understanding it. So what I wanted to do with my research was bring a critique that, despite the fact that there's a really growing understanding of how the world's future is resting on a knife edge, the impact of environment is understood very differently according to a person's socio-cultural or their heritage belonging. So what I sought to do first was clarify the Black perspective on the environment, and look at how much do Black people in the UK think about and how much do they recognise the environment. And secondly, I wanted to understand what barriers may exist that stop them taking pro-environmentally responsible behaviours, or PEBs. So despite having, it was a reasonably small study cohort, but the demographics were really sound, and I had a reasonable sampling, and there was very little bias. So I think what I've got is really good results. Something that we can build on, which adds to the knowledge that's out there. I did it in a mixed methods way, so there was a bit of quantitative stuff and a bit of qualitative. So it's very rounded, and I think I'm pleased to say that I think it's valid. So first of all, I just want to explain the nomenclature that what I've used. When I say Black, what I mean and how it's used. So when we use Black, it's a political and a social context mainly, and it's become quite widespread, but it is contested. and this slide that's up on the screen, it shows a medical definition, which I've used I used in my research as a guidance. Because when you talk about Black, it's a signifier of identity. For people who are of African descent, people who've often been moulded by the legacy of colonialism and of oppression, and the contested part of it is it's about representation. It's about who's describing a grouping. It's sometimes about self-identification. It's about cultural or social representation. So if you think of things like the census that's coming up this weekend, I think, or BME or BAME, which they're often seen to be controlling and linked to power and privilege. And at times it can intersect with oppressions. So until the debate's resolved by the African community itself, you know, and the nuance of that is reflected by the rest of society, I can only apologise for shortcomings in the nomenclature. And I also want to say that how race is conceptualized is also beyond this session. It's not part of what I've looked at. So when I talk about Black in my research, it means of African origin or heritage, and my scope was specifically the Black community in the UK. So I'm going to talk to you about the reasonings for the tests I applied, and why it's important for this context. And it's about the evolution of behaviour change, and how it's been studied and how it's used, and what behavioural science understands, and how it understands what influences change in people, behaviour change. So about 4 or 5 decades ago, there was a sort of a general movement in this part of academia towards what's called post-materialism. And it became quite embedded in Western thought, and it was a seminal moment, and it was based around what Richard Inglehart wrote in this book, which is 1977, I think, The Silent Revolution. And basically it's about how after World War II, there was a sustained period of growth. So huge growth happened across Europe, and values saw a shift from a materialistic outlook to more about self-expression and autonomy. Okay. It was an idea, the idea is that this mindset and this framing in mainstream society became attuned to the environment, which led to broad changes in thinking. And so what's now known as the new environment paradigm, or the new ecological paradigm, NEP, it was about having an attitude to environmentalism. So recognizing that human causes of degradation of the environment, and recognizing that there are limits to growth. And limits to growth, you might remember, was around Donella Meadows, who actually wrote a book, and that led to the Club of Rome. It's all that sort of stuff, including maybe Lovelock's Gaia and the Earth systems theory. They're all good examples of how the evolution of this train of thought came about. So basically we had prosperity in the West and comfort and security after World War II, and it drove people into an inward gaze. And at its core was a rejection of growth and of extractivism. And this is what drove this new environmentalism. And the NEP was actually a way of measuring this attitude. So it was like the dominant social model in society changed, and NEP became aware of how it was all measured. And it was something that I wanted to test in the Black community, because people have often said, is it because we don't have the money? Is it about post-materialism? That drives how Black people think and whether they're involved in the environment. So I wanted to test that specifically. And there are a couple of other theories around it, value belief norms and the theory of planned behaviour, which are quite strong in behaviour change world. And they're all sort of like an unpacking of Maslow. If I say Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I guess most of you will recognise what that is. It's a pyramid that people move up towards the top. Once you've got your comfort and your security, you start to think about self-actualization. And the way environmentalism developed, I suppose, could be an unpacking of Maslow. Yep. And actually, there's one thing, Maslow never used that pyramid in his own work. It was brought in by somebody else. It's just a digression. But here's the crux of it. In behavior change, Maslow and the stuff that Inglehart did, they were culturally biased. What they did was understate the socio-cultural effects as drivers of attitudes. And I am simplifying for brevity here, so if there's any psychologists amongst us or behaviour change I'm simplifying, but this is what the NEP suggests, that affluence, societal position, or individual mindset is what drives positive behaviours. And most of behaviour change still uses these values, and they use them quite often. And it's for good reason. It's a really powerful theoretical part of behaviour change. It's really significant and it's really important. But I'd said, and what I wanted to look at was the fact that it's important as a benchmark. So whilst there's loads of work on behaviour change, and the ones I've just talked to you about, so these are the more prominent threads, the new environmental paradigm, value belief norms, Inglehart, Maslow, and there's others like Stern, Dietz and Ajzen. They all ignore the fact that justice can be a driver to behaviours, especially in Black and marginalised communities. And I think it has an impact on behaviour and on attitude. And that's what I wanted to test. There's cultural shortcomings in it, knows justice. And what I want to do is tell you about things that I propose that have come out of my research, or how I've packaged them up after getting the results that I got. So I've sort of suggested a framework of 3 pillars that have been driving my thought. And I'll go through them. So the first one is, I asked lots of questions and I applied tests to confirm whether attitudes and beliefs are similar in the Black community and whether they fit in with these behaviour change, these behaviouralists, and these psychological ways of thinking and studying attitudes to the environment. And I asked lots of tests. There were lots of questions on different parts of attitude, impact, on beliefs. I asked questions on actual behaviours as well. And what it all came down to was that the evidence tells us environmentalism is broadly universal. It's not just reserved to Western societies and cultures. And I found also that whilst non-Blacks are sort of overrepresented in the environmental movement, they are not necessarily more forward in how the environment is perceived or on responsible behaviours. And on the contrary, I found that the Black community is either equal and in some places a little more advanced in their awareness of climate and ecology, and that the behavioural actions needed to stymie change are well understood. So using all these tests, I was able to mirror and confirm lots of work that's happened in the United States, which has similar findings. So you find over there African-American people, the Latinx, Native Americans and the First Nation people, they're also much more environmentally aware than their non-Black counterparts. And I had lots of examples, but I don't want to go off on that. If people are interested in references, I've got a slide right at the end that I can show to you about some of the work that's happening in the States. So basically, this is just looking at, I've just drawn out a couple of things. And again, I don't really want to go through them all in detail because I had lots of tests. In fact, I had 140 separate data points that I gathered. And whilst I can't cover them all, I can tell you that the cohort, the people that I approached, and the people who responded to the survey showed that there was a lot of environmental understanding amongst them. And as I said, in more places, they were probably more advanced than the rest of society. Some of my tests were original things that I'd devised, and others came from other studies. As I said, there was mainly US things, but I adapted them out. But I also used the European Social Survey, which is quite a big survey. And the last one a couple of years ago was on climate. It had a big part of it was on climate. I think it might be in chapter 8. Very interesting stuff to look at. But again, just want to repeat, environmentalism is broadly universal. So whether you're in the Black community or the non-Black community, the levels of environmental awareness and ecological awareness are very similar. And in some places, probably slightly more for Black people. So that was the first pillar. The second pillar that I wanted to, what I thought came out of it was the fact that the physical locus of existence, the premise that environmental behaviour takes place in a physical realm amongst physical natural environment, what's coupled with identity. And there are some modern behavioural psychologists who do look at this, and they agree that it's generally been ignored in research. So I argue that it's really important for people whose ancestral homeland still has a really strong resonance and they still have a lot of attachment. And this argument, it finds support in both culture, identity and diaspora studies. So people are not looking at it in climate, or not yet. apart from the work that I've done and some American things. But in other areas, they are making these connections. So there is stuff to back this up. And I just included a couple of pictures just to reference that. The fact that, we visit our places back home, but also whilst we're in the UK, the cultural attachment is still there, and the identity and the diaspora, and to a certain extent in campaigns. I think it's also driven by the fact that climate change is a racist crisis, and especially the inequitable aspects of it, of the impacts, the fact that some people suffer it more than others. And a lot of the Black community are really aware of these inequalities, and they're aware that there's a lot of inequity amongst it, especially in their ancestral homelands. I mean, people like most of us, there's a lot of us have been born here, but we still have a connection, and that brings a lot of awareness of the our ancestral roots, and we're aware of the historic and contemporary injustices that have linked them. So I'd suggest that's probably a good indicator of why environmental problems may be higher in Black communities. So I'll talk about the third pillar. There's a wider discussion in society which suggests that having an environmental mindset has more influence than environmental justice as a driver for PEBs. This is what's been talked about in behaviour world in the last few decades. And it's interesting because it suggests that liberation from oppression is secondary to environmental impacts, as something that would drive your behaviours. And this is where my third pillar comes in. It's barriers. I think that there are barriers that exist to the community getting more involved in responsible behaviours. And I find that it's a difficult situation. And this is where the intersection of oppression starts to come, where it starts to appear. And what I mean by that is the perception of environmentalism as more than just a white activity. And it's proven, I think I found evidence for that. But there are factors that exist that marginalise Black people and create these barriers. And the crux is that, I've said, Blacks are more aware of the environment, or as aware, but they experience a feeling of being excluded. So I did ask participants some open-ended questions. This was in the second part of the study. And I gave them space to contribute themselves, just open space, tell me what you think about this. And I tried not to be leading by giving examples. And I got some really, really rich data back, really interesting stuff. And I'll talk to you about the key themes that emerged. And this is where I sort of got ideas of what the barriers were. Two themes, well, a handful of themes: political exclusion, civil engagement, and lack of capacity or resources. These were some of the major things that emerged from it. And of course, it's quite clear that those affected by a changing world are those where the impacts are greatest. So maybe that's what drives a lot of this stuff. Justice and equity is really keenly felt. So exclusion itself was by far the biggest of the concerns. Structural and systemic racism was next. Now this one's in a different colour because it's not a barrier, and it was something that was unlooked for, and it was welcome because it was a theme that came out where people were offering solutions. I didn't ask for solutions, I was looking at barriers, but they offered solutions, and that was quite an exciting part of it. And people are, we're talking about altruism in the community, about technology ideas, innovative ideas about plastic composting, affordable technology, and harnessing the fact that there's already a strong community power and cohesion, and how that could be used in this sort of sphere. So that was quite warming. There was some stuff about resilience and fortitude that was expressed, and I think that seemed to come from the fact that people have lived existentially for hundreds of years, and we've had to internalize survival and succor as a tactic. So you can find a sense of positivity from the community in that way. They're ready to adapt. They know how to adapt. And it shows signs of resilience, the need to be resilient. Now, I have a particular issue with resilience because it's linked too closely to neoliberalism, but that's another discussion, and I don't really want to digress, but pick me up on it another time and we can go into it there. It is one of the three things they talk about: resilience first, and then mitigation and adaptation, but resilience, yeah, let's move on from that. The next of the themes that was quite big was a feeling of disenfranchisement. And then another positive one came up, which is about needs modelling. And this was positive. And I'll say something briefly. It was about the community modelling solutions, either as individuals or as a community, as a group. And then, of course, justice issues sort of arose. Now, I'm going to see if I might have to stop sharing and then come back to this. I want to show you another slide. Okay, so the squares enclose all of the different themes that came up. So one big square here, this one's about racism. These are just the overriding ones. If I switch it over here, you can see how many different subjects as different topics came up from the barriers side of it. And if I go in, you'll see how they dwell down, how people were thinking about education, climate change, how people were excluded from doing extra behaviours. They're excluded from the political side of it. There was some really rich data. Stuff about feeling disenfranchised, how it's such a weary struggle, how Indigenous knowledge is ignored. There's so much stuff I could do a little presentation on each one of these. Political exclusion, the fact that there was no representative politics happening, that financially excluded, how class was a barrier. Class appeared a couple of times. That was quite fascinating, I thought. And of course, the obvious ones of environmental justice and the fact that the environmental movement's so wide. The size of these boxes represents how many responses or how strong the themes were. So I'll just recap on it then. So this is the slide. This shows some of the themes that came out, all about barriers, and then a few around here around solutions and needs modelling. But to recap on the main focus of what we're talking about today, behaviour change, it's focused solely on values and attitudes. That has shortcomings in relation to Black heritage communities. The locus of existence, I think that's relevant, more so than has been recognised and has been used when we try to understand barriers. And the fact that barriers exist to the Black community is an actual reality. And I think most of them come about because of systemic oppression. And that's your mic drop moment. We may not stop climate change because it's something that we all need to do together as a society. Everybody must be involved. And you can't look just to one part of the community to pull their weight, because it's not going to happen. If somebody's not getting involved, then we're not going to get where we need to be as a whole society. And it's noticeable that in the UK, we've got a huge gap in academia and in civil society who are not really looking at these matters. In the United States of America, we see that they've got lots of Black-led environmental campaigns, and they're quite huge. And I believe it's because environmental justice in the USA is linked. The civil rights movement is linked to environmental justice. And in such a way that I think environmental justice is actually on the statute books in the United States. And there's been some really seminal work that's been done by people like Robert Bullard, who's reckoned to be one of the top 100 people on climate in the last half century. But what do we have in the UK? We've got Meghan Markle syndrome, and we've got racism not existing according to the press. And we've got a prime minister who's thought of by most of the Black community as a racist person. We have lots of structural barriers that come from the fact that climate is a racist crisis, and from the general state of common or garden systemic racism. It's like a double punch. So if we do look at the historic roots and recognising that colonialism paid for the Industrial Revolution, which spewed out fossil fuels and all the land grabs around the world, it's churned up the environment and devoured species to extinction. That in itself is a whole of a talk if you want to have it. Climate is a racist crisis. And I could give you some links to some articles that I've written that make a really good referenced argument about it, about how colonial and imperialism has caused climate and ecology demise, and how they're perpetuated oppression. But climate, it belies the facts that our comforts, our securities, and our enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and by exploitation somewhere else. And that's over time and space. And it's a systemic type of violence. I just want to show you this, just before I round up, well, just to sort of finish off. This was from some research that came out at the end of last year about Britain and how it talks about climate change. And it shows you that the foundations of legacies are well known. And I think this slide's quite sorrowful for me, and it embodies a sense of paralysis. And I'll just leave it here so you can take it in. You see the two columns are answers to surveys from the white British community and from the Black community, and how they respond to taking racism seriously or think they're too sensitive about it. It's quite a shocking slide, I think. And as I said, it's got a sense of paralysis around it. So just to sum up, I think inquiry, this sort of research, it shouldn't be just about looking at values that drive behaviour change. I think it's clear in the research that I did that community and that heritage plays a really significant part in how we take up pro-environmentally responsible behaviours. What I identified is a really strong perception of climate and ecology amongst the Black community. And I uncovered a series of barriers that are expressed as themes and stumbling blocks, things that prevent full uptake of responsible behaviour. I've said already, I think environmentalism is broadly universal. I think that the Black perspective is that climate and ecology is a racist crisis, and it's driven by white supremacist structures of society. And I also found that there's a paucity, there's a lack of research on the Black community in the UK and related to the environment. And unless it's within a victim framing, or if it's about African Americans, there's not much here. So there's a real opportunity, I think, that we need to grasp. The literature's got to improve, and it's got to look at heritage communities and look at it on a granular level. And there's all sorts of things that we can suggest looking at, whether it's a reticence to talk about climate amongst community, how identity and heritage impacts on our values and our responsible behaviours, what impact justice has. And it'd be interesting to repeat this work, but in a way that's fully resourced, maybe do it professionally again. And also there's one big thing that came out. I'd really like to understand why gender-based risk was totally absent. There was, and as I said, the demographics were reasonable. It reflected the general society. So half of the respondents identified as female, as women, but yet there was very little talk of gender-based risk, and that was surprising. And I don't know what that's like when you do this sort of research with the rest of society, but it's something interesting. I think I'd need to follow up on and do some more work on. So I'm going to end by saying, unless there's social equity, climate change probably won't be solved. Black people make up a significant part of the global family. And it might be good to remember that, of Margaret Mead. People may have heard of the anthropologist Margaret Mead and James Baldwin, two great thinkers. So they had a 3-day dialogue in 1970. They were both on a stage together for 3 days. I can't remember what it was called, something about rapping, a rap race. I'll find it and I'll tell you, but really interesting stuff. And it was almost prescient. They were talking about guilt and responsibility, and they were talking about the exact same issues, that 3 or 4 decades later are still present. So it begs the question, are we ever going to make progress? And whilst climate change and ecology demise is happening around us in a short, limited time, time's running out. So the question is, where do we go from here? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for speaking to us. Yeah, really appreciate hearing about your research and your perspective. So we wanted to do a Q&A now, and I thought I would start it off by asking you a couple of questions. Yeah, and if people want to, I don't know, like pin Michael or do speaker view, if that's helpful, feel free. So my first question, Michael, is what led you to do the research that you did?
Okay, so thanks for introducing me at the beginning. As I said, I'd given up work because I wanted to train on solutions, and I wanted to understand about the impacts of climate and about ecology and how serious it is. And I found out that whatever you think of it, it's scary. So I had 10% to it. We're in a bad situation and we need to deal with it. And of course, part of the research, it was a master's degree in a science master's. And you have to do a big thesis at the end. And I looked around at things, and I thought about going back to Ghana, where my parents are from, my dad's from, and doing some research there. But of course, coming lockdown, we couldn't get away. So the next obvious thing was looking at climate. And I've been involved in climate campaigns. As I said, I wanted to do stuff with Extinction Rebellion and felt most comfortable working with Extinction Rebellion Jews. Mm-hmm. Mainly because the environmental scene has been so wide. You know, I've been to so many events where, you know, the environmental events or environmental campaigns where you're the only black person there, or one of the only one. So I wanted to understand a little bit more about that, and not just do a piece of work that was interesting and was informative. You know, colleagues did all sorts of stuff and really fascinating. So I wanted to do something that maybe adds to knowledge where there's a big gap. And there certainly is, and we found that nobody's looking at the black community in the UK in terms of climate, not in any big way. There's a couple of things. There's things that happen looking outward, looking at impacts of the heritage countries. So there's a lot of stuff that happens related to the Caribbean, or scientists from here going out and doing work, but not enough happening looking at the communities here. So that was sort of the driver for it. And I think I got some really interesting data.
Yeah. So yeah, of the data you got and your findings, what, if anything, was sort of surprising for you or unexpected?
There are a couple of things. I said I had 140 data points, and I don't want to talk about them, but the ones that stood out the most was the overall view that actually I knew the black community was aware of climate, but how much evidence emerged for it was quite surprising. It was really strong, and in fact, I suppose it should have been obvious, because we're all part of humanity, and if one part of the community has a particular awareness, especially living in the United Kingdom, we have access to the same info, then maybe it should be the same elsewhere. But it was surprising how strong it was. And then looking at particular things, it was obvious why the community is a bit more advanced, because there's stronger connections to the justice sides of it, and to where injustice happens. You know, if it's your family, Kehillah, most people know Kehillah. I don't, she did some, in her school, they did some fundraising for people in Dominica who suffered from a climate-related tragedy, you know, weather-related thing. So the connections are stronger, I feel. That's possibly more obvious. But the other thing that was really interesting was seeing how the solutions were offered without being asked for. So that was quite comforting, and it was quite warming, actually, and really positive, because I asked questions. We know that climate change is bad. We know that things are going to happen. You see the title of it. I want to get the black perspectives, the black community's perspective on climate and the environment. So people know that it's grim, but for them actually to say, well, yeah, but this is what we should do, and to offer unasked for really positive solutions was quite warming as well, and quite positive.
Yeah. And my last question before we open it up is how, these findings and the research you've done, like, how do they affect you as a Jew as well? And you mentioned, I know you're active in XR Jews, and I think one of the reasons that group has been founded is to mobilize people in the Jewish community around the climate and ecological emergency, knowing that without a group like that, maybe there wouldn't be as much Jewish participation in that movement, for example. So yeah, I'm curious about the sort of Jewish side of it for you as well.
Well, a couple of things. I know there's the obvious side of, you know, tikkun olam, of repairing the world, and how that comes from the early part of the Torah, or related to its stewardship, being stewards. So anything we can do, any of us, anything we can do that's small, that can help the environment, help climate, is an important thing. It's a good thing to do. It's a mitzvah. So that aspect of it, the obvious ones, but also I always feel, and I feel quite strongly, that the faith has a big onus on community, and whether it is our own community, you know, which is particularistic, or looking more universally, you know, as a global society, we are embedded together in this problem that we've got, and we will not solve it alone. So the community aspect of it, the fact that the Torah teaches it quite strongly. You know, Moses, well, in the early days of his sort of ministry, where his father-in-law Jethro said, "Don't do it by yourself. Get everybody else involved, you know, and share it out." We can't do it unless we do this together. And if we've got a particular structural problem, which we have, you know, the strong feelings of exclusion, of being disenfranchised or disempowered and no capacity, that's a reality. And if it's there, how do we break it down, and how do we use you know, our communities and how of faith, how Judaism help play into breaking down of global community, bringing it together.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I wanted to open it up to other people to ask questions as well.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. But tell me, is there any movement or involvement in the Black community on environmental questions, or are you rather on your own?
I think there's possibly two ways. That there are people who are involved, but in relation to people doing other stuff, I think maybe not so much, not as much as we need to be, and it's because of the barriers, I think.
Yeah, I mean, for example, are any of them involved with Friends of the Earth or other groups like that?
It's funny because Friends of the Earth had he wasn't Black. They had it's called Asad Rehman was quite central there, and he's been around. He's an Asian guy. I think he's a South Asian guy. He's head of War of One at the moment, and he's been involved in the environment for a long time. And again, he's just one of the only people who's been around. So there's stuff there, and they've done good work at Friends of the Earth, but at the same time, they've done stuff that, you know, some of the early stuff has not been that good. There's a group of organisations who came together who call themselves Wretched of the Earth, and I think I used a slide, a picture in one of the slides, who were involved with some of the big environmental groups, putting on a big march, and they came to conflict, you know, so much so that the environmental groups called the police at this protest march on the Black groups and these people who were representatives of some Indigenous groups. You know, it's shocking stuff. So there's not enough of it, and it's because I think it's because of the barriers that I explained. Yeah. That there are barriers there. It need to be broke down. And you know, there was I don't know if you noticed, but there was one of the barriers was about campaigns, and it's not so much about campaigns getting involved in, but maybe about how campaigns are constructed and how people are not brought into them. You know, one thing about institutional racism, you can say, is if you're not actively going out there to solve this problem and work on whatever it is, whether it's unconscious bias or whether you're looking at diversity and inclusion, you're not doing it enough, then you're guilty of being institutionally racist.
Yeah.
So there's that side of it. The environmental movement needs to be more active. They need to do more stuff to bring in the whole of society. An interesting thing, this came out for some other work that I've done, wasn't related to this, but the most racially abused group, the people who suffer the most in the UK, are the Gypsy Roma traveller community. And I've looked and I've talked to a couple of other academics about it. There's nothing in the environmental movement on GRT and bringing them in. And in places where there's flood risk, you know, they're often quite transient. There's nothing in place for the Gypsy Roma traveller community. Yeah, it's shocking.
I can believe that. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for your talk today. It was very good. I really enjoyed it. And I guess my question is, so in the US, you saw, I saw anyway, with the snowstorms in Texas, that the politician Ted Cruz went to Mexico with his kids to avoid the outages, and the wealthy communities didn't have outages, and the poor communities and the communities of color, they all had outages. So I guess my question is there a solution when the people in power are quite happy to avoid the problem, and the people who are not in power don't really have as much of a, I mean, of course we have the collective power, but if we're not working together, like how are we gonna fight it?
Yeah, really, it's quite important points that you've raised there. Thanks. To talk about the United States, you know, after Hurricane Katrina, how many years ago that was? There's still one of the communities there that doesn't have running water, and still, as I think, has only just got connected back to the grid. They don't have running water. This is, you know, in New Orleans. It's just this day and it's mad. And you're right. Communities have to support each other, and you do see a lot of that going on. Well, we experienced it during the COVID pandemic, how people were helping neighbours in their community, you know, that sort of stuff. We've got these, you know, these terrible leaders in places, but on a grassroots level, there is community, and it is really strong, and it's really great that that's happening, but we just need much more of it. And we need to find ways of breaking down these systems, you know. The media, how the media is used by those in power is really terrible. We don't have any choice except to do this, and we have to try everything we can to push it forward, because without it, we won't survive. And it's sad in a way that it's people that are in the West are now recognizing that it's becoming existential for them. So they're taking note and they're doing things. But are we going to do it quick enough, and is society going to cohese quickly enough to make this change? And thanks for those questions.
Michael, thank you so much. Really interesting, informative, and very helpful in trying to think about these massive problems. My question is a wonder. I wondered if any of your respondents were other Black Jews, and if they were, whether there was anything that you noticed in any of in those responses, anything in the qualitative stuff maybe, or I don't know. I just wondered about that.
No, the way I did the research, I didn't ask people to submit that, and I didn't collect those demographics on religious identity. I was more interested in how people identify in terms of heritage. So I focused on that. One of the shocks, I didn't ask about age either, because it wasn't relevant initially to what I wanted to know. I could have used it, but said, you know, 140 data points. It would have just expanded that. Oh, rich stuff, but it wasn't necessary, and I didn't ask that, and I didn't get that sort of response.
Fantastic, very interesting chat, Michael. Thank you very much. Yeah, you mentioned class a bit in your talk, and I just wondered, yeah, if you think, because from my sort of outside perspective on environmentalism, it's painted in the media, and I think there's truth to it, as sort of a middle class preoccupation, and you know what I mean. That's how it's, you know, it's hippies, middle class thing. Which, I mean, I think there is some, you know, there is something to it. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But that's the perception. But obviously, in Britain, the Black community tends to be, on average, more working class as a whole than the white community. So I just wondered, yeah, what your thoughts on that were, whether your data showed that, you know, anything sort of different from a sort of like that intersection, really.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I can talk to that. Another really important question. First of all, in terms of the respondents and the mix of whether people were more working class or not, the demographics match the rest of society anyway. There are more working class white people than there are rich white people. You know, it was very, but class and race are interlinked inextricably. And you know, whether you look at it now or go back, in colonial times, one of the reasons that whiteness became an actual thing that was promoted was because some of the white indentured slaves were asking for struggle, and they were allying themselves in some parts of the Caribbean. I think Barbados was the first country. The white slaves, these called rednecks, redlegs, I don't know. The white slaves were allying themselves with the black slaves against the colonial masters. And I don't know if it was the British who led it, but they led the fact of promoting whiteness as a superior aspect, and pitting the white poor against the black poor. And that suddenly swept across the whole of Europe and became a big thing. Let's pit the two lower classes against each other and make it a race issue rather than a class issue, because the class issue is just looking at the upper echelons. So absolutely, divide and rule. You're right. It's class is as important as race, I think, in not just in this climate issue, but right across the board. And it is a specific tactic of white supremacy to make sure that the two people you want to keep down, the poorer people, whether they're black or they're white, are against each other rather than looking at where the real problems are in society. So class is really, 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 really significant.
Thanks. So I think Mary had a question, and then I'll read it out. If there's time, I'd like to ask what Michael thinks are the main barriers of entry for Black Brits to environmental movements, and if you have any suggestions of what the organizations need to do to tackle the inequality.
It's a good question, and it's where to start. I mean, there's a whole list of. You saw the slide that I put up, which was the big gridded one, which caused havoc when we tried to look at the NVivo part of it. It's disenfranchised. The fact that campaigns are not developed with Black people in mind. The fact of how they're not communicated. There's different methods of communicating, whether it's channels that are used or different media channels. There are so many things that people could work on. And I think a big thread of it was the fact that heritage is not used in environmentalism. They just stick to something that, as I said, Maslow and the work that was done by the early behavioralists and what's done contemporarily, it's really valid for humanity as a whole. But you need to break it down and start to look at other drivers, other things that cause behavior change, that cause attitudes and develop beliefs and values amongst people. And a big part of that is whether justice is an impact and how people respond to injustice, and identity and belonging. So that locus of existence was quite important, I think. There's a lack of research on it. The UK needs to have more people looking at this, and whether it's in civil society, whether it's in politics, whether it's in campaigning organisations, they need to think about the fact that on a granular level, people are going to respond differently, and you might need to find different ways of including them, and attach that to the fact that we need to break down the systemic systems that we have that hold people back because of race and because of class.
Thanks. Kath and Ren.
I was just going to say, well, thanks very much, Michael. It was very interesting, and Ren found it very interesting as well because he's studying sociology at A level.
Excellent.
And I think he liked your charts and different graphs and things. But what I was going to say was that in Extinction Rebellion Hackney that I'm involved in, there has been a big push to bring in or to approach other environmental Black groups in Hackney, and to not just take them into Extinction Rebellion, but actually make links across the groups, and go as Extinction Rebellion to like events that have been organised by Black groups, and join in, but not as Extinction Rebellion, but as supporters. And we've done things like there's one particular Lynch person in Hackney who started lots of community circles during Black Lives Matter, and she's amazing. She's an Asian woman, and she's been kind of linking these different groups together. So I think there's some really great things that are happening in that sense. Yeah, just a little bit of sort of good that's happening.
Thank you, Kath. And Ren, that's very interesting. And Ren, I'd love to hear more about your sociology work when you're ready, and if you want to. And if you need to know more about the tools I used, I'm happy to tell you to create the graphs and the different things. You're right, Kath, there is lots of positive work going on, and there's lots of great stuff. And it is about understanding that as Audre Lorde says, you know, we don't live single issue lives, so there's not single issue problems. But it helps if we don't push our single issues onto other people when we do stuff. So when I met somebody just on at the weekend who talked about when the environmental campaigns are happening locally, we're in Wolford Forest, the socialist workers always turn up and almost dominate. And that excludes everybody, you know, because it's just their voice, and they're not going into and saying, well, okay, this is one particular issue, but what issues do you have and how can I help you? And that's what I think that is a really valuable thing that community organisers and activists need to understand, that what's an important issue to you that might be different in another group. So how can you support each other? You want to work with me on my campaign, what can I do to support your campaign? How can I be not just an ally but an accomplice for you? How can I put a line for what's important to you rather than just working on what's important for me?
Definitely. And also I was going to just quickly add that I think it really helps to make personal relationships with people, and not just kind of this is a group, but actually make friends with all different kind of people and have real relationships. And that's what kind of it's really important to do that in across all different kind of groups. And yeah,
absolutely.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Ren.
Cool, thanks. And Ren, it's great to have you here. Kat.
Hi. Oh my God. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much. It was really interesting. A lot of things made me think about a lot of things, connect with a lot of things I've been listening to recently. So that work, and it's about those that unlearning and anti-racist racial justice work that needs to be done in the white environmental movement before that work of coming together can be done. Because I think if there's, people that I know, and this is maybe second generation, are very connected to the environment, and they have that memory of the parents, if not themselves, and not from rural communities, and have that longing. Say XR, I can't even see actually anybody wanting to link up with XR. It just has so much of a white middle class face. It's like you'd have to maybe start something else. But anyway.
No, that's interesting points though. There's lots of groups in XI, but it's does it call itself a movement of movements? And you know, I see there are groups that they might not use the name Black XR, but there's the Global Justice Rebellion part of it, which is it's a movement of movements, they call themselves. So there's a group who do some really, really powerful stuff on all Black issues, including some section of them who do lots of stuff on reparations, which is a thing that popped up a couple of times actually. Reparations, they're doing stuff on other sorts of human rights campaigns related to Black people, but also doing environmental stuff. And then there's a youth movement that's really powerful. A youth, not a youth wing, but a youth part of XR that's led by people of color. There's a group that call themselves BIPOC. There's a justice steering group as well, which XR has this strange lot of circles that makes up the organization. It's not meant to have a hierarchy, although that's crept in because of the structures of white society. But there are lots of different circles who are involved at planning level, and some of them are justice groups, and they're led by people of color. So XR is just one group. It's not the only environmental group. There are lots of others. And whilst it has faults, there is some really exciting stuff happening there, and links happening, outside of it. So you're right about that. But there's also the fact that this is a problem that the white community needs to sort out itself. Go do your unconscious bias and training and whatever it is. Do that, and then come back and recognize that as the whole of society, if we want to survive, we have to do it together. And there's a big problem. This structural systemic system that we've got needs to break down. And if it doesn't, none of us will survive. No, thank you for that.
Right. I think we need to close there just because of time. So yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Michael. Thanks to everyone who's here and for all your questions. It's really great to have these groups together and people from other parts of the community.